Ramses II was born into a state that survived by force. Egypt was not a peaceful kingdom when he entered the world. It was a disciplined machine, rebuilt after humiliation, held together by armies, temples, and fear of collapse. Power was not inherited gently, it was enforced daily. Around 1303 BC, the child who would later call himself Uzurmatre Setapenra was born to Seti I, a king who ruled like a general. Seti did not believe in distant heirs. He believed in visible strength. From the beginning, Ramses was not raised to wait. He was raised to be seen. As a boy, Ramses was taken to military camps and border regions. He watched drills, executions, and negotiations conducted under threat. He learned early that authority depended on posture as much as command. Soldiers followed confidence. Doubt spread faster than rebellion. By the age of 10, Ramses was publicly named crown prince. This was not ceremony. It was calculation. Egypt needed continuity that looked inevitable. By his early teens, Ramses was already present in campaigns in Canaan and along contested frontiers. He did not lead alone, but he stood where men could see him, where banners could frame his figure. Seti, I understood something brutal about empire. Loyalty fades quickly when a ruler disappears. Ramses was trained to replace his father before his father was gone. Inside Egypt, threats did not announce themselves. Priests controlled belief, nobles controlled land, generals controlled force. Each smiled while counting advantages. Ramses learned to listen without trusting and to reward without surrendering leverage. When Seti I died, the transition was swift. Egypt did not mourn long. The system moved forward because it had been prepared to. Ramses II took the throne young, confident, and aware that youth invited challenge. He answered challenge with image. Statues rose across the Nile Valley. Ramses was carved taller than human scale, presented as eternal, equal to gods. This was not vanity, it was deterrence. In Egypt, memory was authority. To control the future, one controlled what was seen. He ordered temples expanded and walls inscribed with his name. Victories were announced before they were secured. Power, Ramses understood, was believed before it was proven. But belief had limits. To the north stood the Hittite Empire, organized, disciplined, and unafraid of Egyptian monuments. They controlled strategic cities and trade routes. They studied Egypt's movements. They prepared. Ramses wanted more than defense. He wanted dominance that could not be questioned. He believed visibility could become reality if enforced long enough. The empire moved toward war. The armies assembled. The roads north opened. Messages crossed deserts and valleys. Ramses marched believing the image he had created would carry him through what force alone might not. He did not yet know that the coming confrontation would define his reign, not by outcome alone, but by how truth would be reshaped afterward. The legend began forming before the battle was fought. Ramses II did not wait for threats to grow. He moved early, before doubt could settle. Youth was a weakness only if it hesitated. Ramses refused to hesitate. One of his first decisions as king was to shift the center of power northward. The old capital symbolized tradition, but tradition did not hold borders. Ramses founded a new royal city in the delta, Pi-Ramesses. It was not built for beauty, it was built for war. Pi-Ramesses was a machine disguised as a capital. Barracks, stables, armories, and supply depots dominated the landscape. Chariots could be deployed within hours. Messengers moved faster than ritual. From there, Ramses could strike Asia or defend Egypt without delay. This was a message to enemies and elites alike. The king was no longer distant. He was present, mobile, and watching. Ramses reinforced the eastern frontier immediately. Garrisons were strengthened, fortresses rebuilt. Vassal cities were reminded who protected them and who would punish disobedience. Campaigns into Canaan followed, not massive invasions, but calculated shows of force. Cities submitted, leaders pledged loyalty, tribute flowed. But beneath the surface, the balance was unstable. The Hittite Empire controlled key territories further north. They were not tribal enemies. They were organized, diplomatic, and experienced in war. They did not fear Egyptian titles or statues. They measured strength by logistics and timing. Both empires watched each other closely. Ramses demanded reports constantly. He studied maps, supply routes, terrain. He learned that war was not decided at the moment of battle, but months earlier, by preparation, deception, and momentum. Inside Egypt, Ramses tightened control. He rewarded loyalty quickly and visibly. Promotions were given to competence, not lineage. This built devotion among soldiers but resentment among older elites. Ramses noticed and did not care. He understood another truth of rule. Stability creates enemies as surely as chaos does. Temples expanded their inscriptions. Ramses appeared everywhere, smiting enemies, offering to gods, ruling eternally. The repetition was intentional. The population did not need to know the details of foreign threats. They needed to believe their king was invincible. Yet Ramses knew belief alone would fail when tested. Reports from the north grew alarming. Hittite influence expanded, alliances shifted, Egyptian vassals hesitated, tribute slowed, silence replaced loyalty. Ramses interpreted silence correctly. It meant preparation. He ordered full mobilization. The army was divided into divisions named after gods: Amun, Ra, Ptah, Seth. Chariots were counted, supplies stockpiled, scouts sent ahead, intelligence gathered from merchants, prisoners, and defectors. Ramses planned to move fast and decisively. His objective was not destruction alone, but demonstration. He intended to break Hittite confidence by striking a symbolic center: Kadesh. The city sat near the Orontes River, fortified and strategically vital. Control of Kadesh meant dominance over Syria. Losing it meant watching influence bleed away. Ramses believed speed would secure victory. He trusted reports that claimed the Hittite king was far away. He accepted intelligence that confirmed his expectations. It was the most dangerous kind of belief. The army marched north in confidence. The banners moved. The king rode with the Amun division at the front, eager to claim decisive glory. Behind the movement lay calculation. Ahead lay uncertainty, disguised as opportunity. The road to Kadesh was not just a march toward battle. It was a test of judgment. Ramses had prepared Egypt to believe in him. Now he prepared to force history to agree. What waited beyond the next horizon would decide whether his image would become truth or whether truth would expose the image. The march continued. The trap was already closing. The march north intensified the illusion of control. Ramses advanced with confidence, shaped by reports that seemed precise, reassuring, and disastrously wrong. Scouts brought news that the Hittite king was far away, retreating north with his forces. Prisoners repeated the same story. The intelligence aligned too cleanly. It told Ramses exactly what he expected to hear. Speed became his obsession. He pushed the Amun division forward, separating it from the rest of the army. The Ra, Ptah, and Seth divisions lagged behind along the route, stretched across miles of difficult terrain. Supply wagons slowed movement. Communication thinned. The king rode ahead, believing momentum would compensate for distance. Near Kadesh, the landscape tightened. The Orontes River curved around the city. Fields narrowed into choke points. Hills masked movement. Ramses established his camp quickly, confident that surprise favored him. It did not. Hidden behind the terrain, the Hittite army waited in silence. Thousands of chariots stood ready, crews disciplined, horses rested. Their king had not retreated. He had concealed. The deception had worked. When the Hittite chariots struck, they did not probe. They slammed into the Egyptian camp with force designed to break structure, not morale. Tents collapsed. Wagons overturned. Horses panicked. Soldiers ran before orders could form. The Amun division was isolated. Ramses found himself surrounded by chaos, not battle lines. The image of control shattered in moments. Commanders were cut off. Messengers failed. The field dissolved into individual survival. For the first time in his reign, Ramses faced the possibility of total collapse. Accounts later claimed he stood alone, fighting heroically, rallying men by sheer presence. The reality was harsher. He fought to stabilize a situation already lost to surprise. He acted decisively, But decisiveness could not erase the mistake that placed him there. He ordered regrouping where possible. He moved to high ground. He forced surviving units to form defensive pockets. The Hittite attack had speed, but it lacked cohesion after impact. Chariots scattered in pursuit of plunder. Control slipped. Time mattered more than courage. As the Hittites pressed, the raw division arrived unexpectedly, colliding into the chaos. Their arrival did not reverse the disaster, but it slowed it. Fighting thickened. Momentum stalled. Hours passed in exhaustion and confusion. Dust blurred vision. Noise drowned commands. Ramses held the center long enough for the remaining divisions to approach. By late day, the Iithe division reached the field. Pressure shifted. What began as a near annihilation stabilized into a brutal stalemate. Neither side achieved decisive control. The Hittites withdrew to regroup. Ramses did not pursue. He could not. The battlefield fell silent under the weight of what had almost occurred. Kadesh did not end in victory. It ended in survival. That night, Ramses understood the danger of believing intelligence that flatters ambition. He also understood something else. Defeat could be reshaped before it hardened into memory. The scribes worked immediately. Inscriptions would later claim overwhelming triumph. The king would be depicted as unstoppable. The narrative would erase vulnerability. Egypt would see a victory carved into stone. But the army knew the truth. The road to Kadesh had exposed the limits of speed without caution, of image without verification. Ramses had not been defeated, but he had been tested at the edge of annihilation. The war, however, was far from finished. What Kadesh proved was not dominance, but parity. And parity between empires meant prolonged conflict. Ramses would not abandon the field. He would adapt. The next phase would not be decided by a single day, but by years of pressure, diplomacy, and calculated force. The myth had survived. Now, it needed reinforcement. After Kadesh, the war did not explode. It dragged. That was more dangerous. Ramses returned to Egypt with a narrative forged in stone, but strategy had to be forged in time. The Hittites still held Kadesh. Their alliances across Syria remained intact. No decisive blow had been delivered by either side, and that stalemate reshaped everything. The age of quick conquest was over. What followed was a grinding contest of pressure. Year after year, Ramses marched north again, not for spectacle, but for attrition. Cities were isolated rather than stormed. Garrisons were starved instead of smashed. Supply routes became targets. Influence mattered more than banners. Ramses learned from Kadesh. He stopped racing ahead of his army. Divisions moved tighter. Scouts were doubled. Intelligence was tested against contradiction, not hope. He did not abandon speed, but he wrapped it in caution. Campaign by campaign, Egypt pushed its presence deeper into contested territory. Amuru shifted allegiance. Coastal cities felt Egyptian pressure through trade leverage and military threat combined. Ramses did not always destroy resistance. Sometimes he bought it. Sometimes he waited. This was not glory warfare. It was control warfare. The Hittites responded in kind. They avoided open confrontation. They reinforced alliances. They harassed borders. Syria became a chessboard soaked in blood where neither empire could afford to blink. Years passed. Neither side collapsed. Both bled. Ramses began to understand a truth his predecessors had resisted. Total victory was no longer possible without total exhaustion. Egypt could win battles forever and still lose stability at home. The empire was vast. Resources were finite. Time was not loyal. Inside Egypt, Ramses reinforced authority aggressively. Monumental building projects accelerated, not just for vanity, but for legitimacy. Temples rose to anchor loyalty. Statues multiplied his presence across the land. Gods were aligned with his image. Order was not just enforced, it was displayed. While armies marched abroad, stone spoke at home. Ramses framed himself as eternal, unshakable, divinely sanctioned. The more distant the war became, the closer he pulled power inward. But the Hittites did something unexpected. They reached for peace, not surrender, balance. Both empires were strained. Borders were unstable. External threats loomed beyond the horizon. A prolonged war risked collapse from within rather than defeat from without. Negotiations began cautiously. Envoys crossed lines that armies could not. Words replaced chariots. What emerged was unprecedented. A treaty. Not a truce, not a pause. A formal agreement recognizing parity. The Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty did not declare victory. It declared reality. Borders were acknowledged. Mutual defense was promised. Extradition clauses were written. Succession stability was guaranteed. It was power codified into law rather than force. Ramses presented the treaty as triumph, and in a sense, it was. Egypt did not conquer the Hittites, but it did not fall to them either. The empire stabilized. For the first time in generations, the northern frontier stopped burning constantly. Resources flowed back inward. Ramses turned fully to what he would become most remembered for, not as a general, but as a constructor of permanence. Cities expanded, temples multiplied. Abu Simbel was carved from living rock, a declaration aimed as much at Nubia as at time itself. Ramses did not want to be remembered as a king. He wanted to be unavoidable. Yet beneath the stone and ceremony, the truth lingered. The empire he preserved was balanced on careful restraint, not overwhelming force. Peace had been achieved not through domination, but through recognition of limits. Ramses ruled longer than any rival could wait out. That was his true weapon, but longevity carries its own cost. As decades passed, succession anxiety grew. Princes died, heirs aged, the court filled with shadows maneuvering for a future without him. The man who once rode at the head of chariots now ruled through ritual, memory, and architecture. His image stayed young. His body did not. The war with the Hittites had ended. The war with time had begun, and no treaty could stop that. Peace did not make Ramses softer. It made him more dangerous. Once the fighting eased, he turned the empire inward and did what few conquerors ever manage. He converted survival into permanence. War had proven limits. Now Ramses would prove endurance. The treaty with the Hittites was not just ink. It was strategy carved into diplomacy. To seal it, Ramses accepted what would have sounded unthinkable a generation earlier, a Hittite royal marriage. A foreign princess entered Egypt. Her arrival turned into spectacle, her identity absorbed into the machinery of Pharaoh. To the public, it looked like triumph. To the court, it was a warning. Even former enemies could be folded into Ramses' order. And Ramses' order was expanding everywhere at once. Pi-Ramesses grew into a northern command capital that felt less like a city and more like a mobilization engine. Stables, workshops, administrative quarters, and storage yards multiplied. Grain moved in controlled streams. Weapons were produced in scale. Horses were trained as if war might restart tomorrow, because Ramses never trusted peace to last. In the south, he pushed the frontier into Nubia with the same logic Egypt always used. Control the corridor, control the wealth. Garrisons and fortresses anchored the river. Gold mines and trade routes fed the state. Rebellions were met with swift suppression, not because Ramses enjoyed violence, but because disorder was contagious. He was building an empire that could not afford infection. Then came the architecture, his real conquest. Ramses covered Egypt with stone that repeated one message. He was not a man passing through time, he was time's owner. At Thebes, he expanded and reshaped sacred space. Karnak and Luxor were not merely temples. They were political theaters where gods endorsed the king in public. The Ramesseum rose as a monument to rule itself. Colossal statues, towering pylons, long halls designed to make visitors feel small before they even remembered why they came. And beyond all of it, Abu Simbel was carved from the cliff like a threat frozen in rock. 4 giant seated figures of Ramses stared outward, dominating the landscape, declaring to the south and to history that Egypt's border was guarded by a king who refused to shrink, even in silence. But stone is expensive. So is peace. For all the glory, the empire needed administration that did not fail. Ramses strengthened bureaucracy, expanded oversight, tightened the flow of taxes and labor. Egypt's wealth depended on controlled harvests, controlled transport, controlled temples, controlled records. Scribes became as important as soldiers. Every shipment, every workforce, Every offering list became part of the same system, predictable order. And Ramses understood the deepest weapon of all, memory management. He did not allow Kadesh to remain a stalemate in Egyptian consciousness. He turned it into victory by force of repetition. Inscriptions described him as the lone storm, the king who shattered enemies through divine favor. Reliefs showed the enemy fleeing, the king striking, the gods approving. The details were shaped to serve the conclusion. Because for Ramses, history was not a record, it was a tool. For decades, this worked. Egypt stabilized, borders held, trade flowed, the court ran. The priesthood remained powerful but contained within royal narrative. The army stayed ready but no longer bled constantly in Syria. Ramses's reign became the image of imperial strength, a king who fought, then built, then outlasted rivals. But longevity produces a quiet terror: succession. Ramses had many children, many princes, many potential futures, and time began eliminating them one by one. Heirs who should have ruled after him died before him. Generations shifted under the weight of one man refusing to leave the throne, not out of weakness, but because the state had been trained to depend on his presence. The court adapted by flattery and maneuver. Princes competed for proximity. Officials competed for favor. Priests expanded influence through ritual. Everyone planned for a world after Ramses, while still pretending the after was impossible. And Ramses, aging but relentless, watched it all. The king who once chased borders with chariots now hunted stability with ceremonies, decrees, and construction. His image stayed young on walls. His body did not. His voice carried authority, but the years beneath it were visible to anyone close enough to see. The empire looked eternal, but it was being held together by one aging hand. And the closer Ramses came to the end, the more the real question sharpened inside every palace corridor. What happens to an empire built around a single name, when that name finally stops breathing? Old age did not loosen Ramses's grip, it narrowed it. As decades passed, the court learned how to function around an immortal absence. Ramses was present everywhere, on walls, on statues, in prayers, but increasingly distant in body. Orders traveled through layers of officials who spoke in his name. Authority became procedural, not personal. That shift was invisible to the public and dangerous to the state, because Egypt had not prepared for anything else. The priesthood sensed it first. Temples accumulated land, labor, and surplus. Ritual calendars thickened. Festivals expanded. Gods were honored louder, longer, and more expensively, and the priests who managed those gods grew indispensable. Ramses had balanced them with royal spectacle for decades. Now the balance leaned. In Thebes, Amun's influence deepened. The god's voice, spoken by priests, began to sound increasingly like policy. It was subtle, it was polite, it was irreversible. Ramses responded the only way he knew how, by doubling down on permanence. He commissioned more monuments, more reliefs, more inscriptions, not to announce new victories, but to restate old ones. Kadesh appeared again and again, the king charging alone, the enemy collapsing, the gods approving. Memory was being reinforced because reality was shifting, and beneath the stone, the generational clock kept ticking. Princes continued to die. Sons raised for rule were buried before their father. The line of succession stretched thinner, then older. Eventually, the heir who remained was no young conqueror, but a man shaped by waiting, Merneptah. Merneptah had lived his entire life in Ramses' shadow. He had commanded. He had administered. He had watched power function through ritual and habit rather than momentum. He was prepared to inherit an empire, but not to replace the man who defined it. Foreign powers noticed the stillness. The Hittite frontier remained quiet, but vigilance replaced fear. In the Levant, vassals tested boundaries. Tribes along the eastern Mediterranean shifted allegiances when Egyptian oversight softened. The sea peoples, raiders and migrants moving through the region, began appearing more frequently on Egypt's periphery. They were not an army yet. They were a symptom. Ramses ordered defenses reinforced, garrisons inspected, patrols increased. The machine still worked, but it no longer expanded. It reacted. Inside Egypt, Order held. The Nile flooded predictably. Granaries filled, trade moved, life went on. But the system had become heavy, dependent on scale rather than speed. Everything took longer. Decisions traveled farther. Corrections arrived later. This was the cost of endurance. Ramses's final years were ceremonial in appearance and strategic in intention. He presided over jubilees. He reaffirmed divine favor. He stood, or was positioned, before crowds as living proof that Egypt's stability was unbroken. But stability built on one lifespan has a deadline. When Ramses finally died, after nearly 7 decades on the throne, there was no shock, only release. He was buried with full honors, surrounded by the symbols of a life that had rewritten Egyptian expectations of kingship. His tomb did not mark the end of an era in stone, but in function. Because the moment he was gone, Egypt learned the difference between a long reign and a permanent system. Merneptah inherited an empire that still stood tall, but stood still. He moved quickly to assert control. Campaigns in Libya repelled invasions. A coalition of sea peoples and Libyan tribes was crushed. Victory inscriptions were carved. One line mentioned a people in Canaan, Israel, defeated among others. Egypt still fought, still won. But something had changed. Wars were now defensive, borders were now reactive. Power no longer intimidated by momentum. The structures Ramses built were strong, but they were not agile. The bureaucracy he perfected preserved order, not innovation. The priesthood he contained now negotiated power. The army he celebrated now protected lines instead of pushing them. Ramses had created the ideal image of empire. He had not created its replacement engine. And Egypt would spend the generations after him discovering what happens when greatness outlives the conditions that created it. The monuments remained. The name endured. The myth held. But the world beyond Egypt did not stop moving, and it would not wait for stone to adapt. After Merneptah, the illusion cracked, not in collapse, in erosion. Egypt did not fall apart overnight. It weakened the way stone erodes, grain by grain, flood by flood, ruler by ruler. The throne passed quickly now. Reigns shortened, authority fragmented. What Ramses had held together by presence alone began to separate under weight. The 20th dynasty inherited Ramses' architecture without his gravity. Seti II ruled briefly. Court factions rose immediately. Succession became argument instead of inevitability. Power moved behind screens. Royal decrees were negotiated before they were issued. The palace learned to whisper. Then came Tauseret, a queen ruling in her own right. A rare event, and a dangerous one, in a system built for male divinity. She held power through alliances, not fear, through legitimacy, not dominance. The army watched, the priests calculated, the provinces waited. When Tauseret fell, the vacuum opened. Siptah followed, young, controlled, surrounded by regents and power brokers who spoke in his name while carving Egypt into personal territories. The throne still existed. Control did not. At the edges, enemies no longer tested Egypt. They pressed it. Libyan groups migrated deeper into the delta. Sea peoples moved not as raiders, but as settlers. Entire populations shifted across the eastern Mediterranean, driven by pressures Egypt could not influence. This was not a war Egypt was built to fight. Ramses III tried. He ruled with urgency, aware of the shadow behind him. He reinforced borders, mobilized fleets, fortified the delta. He met invasion with preparation rather than denial. The sea peoples came by land and sea, a confederation without a single name, families with weapons, ships carrying warriors, women, children. They were not here to plunder. They were here to replace. At the Nile Delta, Egypt held. Ramses III crushed the invasion. Bodies filled the water, ships burned, captives were resettled as forced labor and soldiers. Inscriptions celebrated victory. Walls showed triumph. The king stood tall. But the cost was permanent. Egypt had defended itself and proven it could still fight. But it had also revealed its limit. The economy strained. Resources were diverted. Supply chains tightened. The army consumed more than it produced. Worse, something unprecedented happened. Workers at Deir el-Medina stopped working. They were not paid, so they refused. The first recorded labor strike in history unfolded not in rebellion, but in exhaustion. Artisans who built royal tombs sat down and waited. The state negotiated. That moment mattered more than any battle, because it meant the system could no longer assume obedience. Power had become transactional. Inside the palace, conspiracies followed. The harem conspiracy unfolded. Assassination attempts, internal sabotage. Ramses III survived the invasion. He did not survive his own court. When he died, possibly murdered, Egypt lost its last king who could command fear beyond ceremony. What followed was not chaos. It was normalization of weakness. Ramses IV through Iithe ruled over diminishing authority. Priests of Amun controlled Thebes. High priests commanded armies. The pharaoh became symbolic in the south and administrative in the north. Egypt split in function before it split in name. The king still existed, but Egypt no longer belonged to him. Ramses II had ruled by presence. His successors ruled by inheritance. And inheritance is fragile. The empire did not end with fire. It ended with paperwork, with titles replacing command, with ritual replacing decision, with memory replacing momentum. Ramses had built eternity, but eternity does not move, and the world beyond Egypt was already changing its rules. The third intermediate period did not arrive with a scream. It arrived with acceptance. Egypt fractured without admitting it had fractured. In the north, Tanis ruled in name. In the south, Thebes ruled in reality. Between them, the Nile still flowed, but loyalty did not. Pharaohs wore crowns. High priests of Amun held armies. The titles remained ancient. The balance was new. The priesthood did not overthrow the throne. It absorbed it. Generations passed with kings who could not command beyond their city walls. Decrees were issued, copied, archived, and ignored. Taxes were negotiated. Military campaigns were rare, defensive, limited. Foreign powers noticed. Libyan chiefs settled permanently in the delta. Not invaders. Governors. They married into Egyptian families, adopted titles, learned rituals, commanded troops. Eventually, they crowned themselves. The 22nd dynasty began not with conquest, but with normalization. Shoshenq-Bar ruled as both Libyan warlord and Egyptian pharaoh. He restored order through force, reorganized the army, reasserted foreign policy. For a moment, Egypt looked whole again. That moment was brief, because Shoshenq ruled through power, not myth, and myth had been Egypt's glue. After him, fragmentation returned. Multiple kings ruled simultaneously, each legitimate, each limited. Assyria rose in the east, relentless, disciplined, uninterested in symbolism. Egypt was no longer a threat. It was a corridor. Assyrian armies marched through the Levant. They reached Egypt's borders, then crossed them. Memphis fell. The delta burned. Pharaohs fled south. Egypt, which once dictated terms to the world, now negotiated survival. Kush rose from the south. Nubian kings, steeped in Egyptian religion, claimed to restore true order. The 25th dynasty marched north. They reunified Egypt, revived temples, restored rituals, honored the old gods. For a moment, it felt like rebirth. But history does not rewind. Assyria returned, with siege engines, with iron discipline, with no reverence for tradition. The Nubians fought. They lost. Thebes was sacked, temples looted. The city that once crowned gods was reduced to a lesson. Egypt became a client state, then a prize, then a memory of power. Persia conquered it. Alexander took it. Rome absorbed it. Pharaohs continued, in image only. What remained was language, stone, legacy. Egypt did not vanish. It transformed into influence. Its gods survived in names. Its architecture shaped empires. Its administration taught the world how to rule time itself. But the age of command was over. Not because Egypt failed, but because the world had learned how to move faster than eternity. And eternity, once built, cannot adapt. It can only endure. Until endurance is no longer enough. What survived Egypt was not territory. It was method. Long after armies stopped marching under the double crown, the systems remained in use by others who understood their value better than the Egyptians themselves ever had. The Persians learned it first. They did not rule Egypt as conquerors. They ruled it as administrators. They kept the temples. They kept the scribes. They kept the tax system. They kept the calendar. Because Egypt had already solved the problem every empire eventually faces: how to control millions without constant war. Alexander understood this immediately. He did not destroy Egypt. He stepped into it. He wore the crown, honored the priests, founded Alexandria not to replace Memphis, but to redirect the future. Greek language fused with Egyptian structure. Gods merged, rituals adapted, power changed hands without changing shape. Rome learned slower, but it learned deeper. When Rome took Egypt, it did not treat it like a province. It treated it like a machine. Grain flowed north, gold flowed west, orders flowed outward. Egypt fed empires that never understood it. Pharaohs became symbols. Governors became kings in practice. Legions replaced priestly armies. But the Nile still dictated life. Flood cycles still ruled survival. Time still marched by Egyptian logic. Rome copied the census, copied land division, copied record-keeping, copied divine authority reshaped as imperial destiny. Augustus ruled like a pharaoh without calling himself one. So did every emperor after him. When Christianity arrived, it did not erase Egypt. It absorbed it. Monasteries replaced temples, saints replaced gods, processions replaced festivals. But the structure remained identical. The desert became sacred again, not for gods, for withdrawal, for control through absence. The language shifted, the script died, the mindset endured. Centuries later, Islamic rule arrived. And again, Egypt adapted. New rulers, same river, same necessity. Bureaucracy survived every conquest. Agriculture dictated politics. Central authority lived or died by flood management. Egypt was no longer an empire, but it was never powerless. It shaped whoever ruled it. Every conqueror arrived believing Egypt was a prize. Every conqueror left shaped by it, because Egypt was never just land, it was training. Training in how to rule time, how to organize belief, how to make obedience feel ancient and inevitable. That was its final victory. Not dominance, permanence. Empires rose and fell loudly. Egypt faded quietly. But the world it taught how to rule never stopped using the lesson. And that is why Egypt never truly ended. It stopped commanding, but it never stopped instructing. Civilizations that forgot speed collapsed. Civilizations that forgot structure dissolved. Egypt taught both. And when the modern world speaks of state, administration, taxation, ritual authority, and symbolic power, it is still speaking Egyptian, without knowing it. That is the shadow that remains. Not ruins, not pyramids, not gold, method, and methods do not die. They wait. What finally remained was not a ruler, not a dynasty, not even a border. What remained was a pattern. Every civilization that followed Egypt believed it had escaped the past. Every one of them was wrong, because Egypt did not teach how to conquer. It taught how to endure. Power there was never loud. It was repetitive, predictable, ritualized. It trained people to obey rhythms before orders, to fear disruption more than authority, to accept hierarchy as natural as the rivers rise. That mindset survived conquest better than any army. When Greeks ruled, Egypt taught them patience. When Romans ruled, Egypt taught them logistics. When emperors ruled, Egypt taught them symbolism. When religions ruled, Egypt taught them structure. Every system that touched it absorbed something. Every ruler left altered. Modern states still operate inside the same framework. Taxation timed to cycles, legitimacy wrapped in ritual, authority disguised as continuity, change presented as restoration. Even revolution borrows Egyptian logic. Destroy the symbol, replace it with another. Keep the structure intact. That is why true collapse never came. Only transition. Egypt understood something few civilizations ever did. that people do not obey force for long, but they will obey familiarity forever. So it built familiarity into everything: time, law, belief, death. Even resistance followed rules. Even rebellion had form. And when Egypt finally stopped producing rulers of its own, it produced rulers for everyone else. The pharaoh did not vanish. He multiplied. He reappeared as emperor, as caliph, as king, as president, as state. Every strong ruler since has borrowed something Egyptian, whether knowingly or not: centralization, monumental imagery, control of food, control of narrative, control of time. The pyramids were not tombs, they were messages. They said, "This system outlives you, serve it." That message worked. Millennia passed, languages died, gods changed, borders vanished, but administration remained, hierarchy remained, obedience remained. That is why Egypt never needed to conquer the world. It taught the world how to conquer itself, and the world listened. The final irony is simple. Egypt is remembered as ancient, but it operates inside every modern state. When power claims inevitability, when authority hides behind tradition, when order is valued above freedom, Egypt is present, not as history, as infrastructure. That is the true ending, not collapse, not defeat, not disappearance, assimilation. Egypt did not fall, it dissolved into everyone else, and that is why it still rules, quietly, patiently, unchallenged, because systems do not need crowns to reign, they only need time. Ramses II did not fall. He outlived the moment that could defeat him. He ruled so long that Egypt forgot how to exist without him. Victory became memory. Stability became habit. Power stopped moving. He did not leave behind a broken empire. He left behind an empire that could only repeat itself. What followed was not collapse, but inertia. Not defeat, but delay. Not chaos, but quiet decline. Ramses was not the last great pharaoh because he failed. He was the last because he succeeded too completely. He proved that endurance can be more dangerous than ambition, that systems built to last often forget how to change, that eternity, once achieved, becomes a trap. Egypt did not die after Ramses. It simply stopped leading history and began teaching it. Others conquered faster, others adapted quicker, but all of them ruled using methods Egypt invented. Ramses built monuments to defy time. Time accepted the challenge and waited, because empires do not end when they fall. They end when the world learns from them, and the world learned everything from Egypt.